Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at how the current policy mix is being used to achieve strong and sustainable growth and full employment. So first of all, the tricks to answering this question is first of all to define what strong and sustainable growth is, and then the rest of your answer you should be linking to both the strong and the sustainable part of economic growth. I suggest you use budgetary and monetary mainly to focus on the strong impacts, and the link to supply side policy is all about sustainable growth. So not only improving the environment, but making sure that we can grow without inflationary pressures by alleviating capacity constraints and boosting efficiency and things. So in terms of linking monetary policy to growth, you should be getting quite good at this. A very accommodative stance in 2015-2016 because inflation is under control, and explain that through one of the channels. In terms of budgetary policy, again, this should be revision. It was a slightly contractionary budget because they're focusing on fiscal consolidation. This year's budget is mildly contractionary with a fall in the deficit from 39 to 37 billion, which will also help to contain inflationary pressures, which will allow monetary policy to be more stimulatory. This sentence is really good to get in the habit of using. The idea that even though the budget has been mildly contractionary, it helps sustainable growth by keeping inflation under control, so monetary policy can focus on the more expansionary stance. Within this, you also want to talk about specific policies that are being used to boost strong growth. So you can talk about tax cuts in terms of company tax cuts, depreciation allowances, the youth jobs plan. All of these are helping to achieve strong and sustainable growth, and you can link them to creating employment and creating higher incomes and things like that. When you're talking about aggregate supply side policies, my idea is that you choose a couple that are distinct from budgetary policy. So you can talk about how microeconomic reform policies, in our case trade liberalisation, is giving access to foreign markets. So the idea that we've got lower tariffs on our exports, which is creating additional employment in like the dairy industry and beef industry and things like that. You can also talk about infrastructure spending, strong levels of skilled migration, and how environmental policies are helping to alleviate capacity constraints, reduce skill shortages, and boost our productive capacity. Because you're not really going to have time to talk about all of these, I suggest you talk about perhaps one or two supply-side policies within the budget, and then just briefly about how microeconomic reform policy and immigration are helping to achieve more sustainable growth by lowering costs of production, giving access to more resources going forward. So in terms of when you're answering these questions, it's always good to have a bit of current knowledge of what to talk about. So you can talk about how, with the end of the mining boom and the fall in the terms of trade, this has made it harder for Australia to grow. And also the fact that the lower cash rate is having less of an effect now than it has in the past, partly because of that idea of deleveraging. And therefore aggregate supply is having to be more and more proactive in terms of stimulating our growth going forward and ensuring efficiency and growth in the future. And ensuring that we boost our productivity so we can remain competitive, because again we can't rely on our high commodity prices, so we have to find other ways to penetrate world markets. So again, it's really a very broad answer where you've talked about what monetary policy is doing and why there's sort of limited scope with monetary policy now with interest rates being so low. The fact that the budget is being slightly contractionary and how that can hurt growth, and then linking some supply side policies into your answer as well and how they help. As it says here, a good way to tackle this question is to focus on how budgetary and monetary policy are allowing for strong growth, while supply side policies keep growth sustainable. Full employment, there will be some similarities with your full employment answer to your strong and sustainable growth answer. Again, you can focus on monetary policy being expansionary, talk about the fall in the cash rate, explain how that will create employment through some of the channels, through increasing discretionary income, and so on and so forth. Or you can talk about the exchange rate channel, where we should create more demand for our exports. With budgetary policy, in terms of how budgetary policy helps to achieve full employment, they have more of a microeconomic focus, so they can focus and really target specific sectors of the economy that are struggling, and that can help to create employment as well. If you are referring to this year's budget, so this is just a bit of information about the last two, but it's more important to be focusing on policies within this year's budget, and I'd suggest you be talking about the youth jobs path, providing a bit of detail in that. Don't just list what it is, explain how it works, as well as some other policies that have boosted demand, like the lower company tax rates. Again, so you've talked about what monetary is doing, talking about what budgetary policy is doing. You can make reference to the fact that, again, that the stance has been mildly contractionary, and then make some links to how aggregate supply side policies, like infrastructure spending, how the beef, you can talk about the beef roads program, you can talk about cuts in the company tax, because they will have supply side benefits in the long term, and then make some links to how some other supply side policies, like the free trade agreements with China and Japan, should provide employment opportunities for things like agriculture and beef and dairy and things like that, as well as opening up our service industries. Be mindful though that you can also talk about some of the negatives about full employment. So with aggregate supply side policies, you could make some reference to the fact that immigration policies in particular can lead to more structural unemployment in the short term as more people come over here, and it can be harder for Australians to get access to training. So I suggest you don't just talk about all the positives here. You can talk about the negatives from a contractionary because the budget is slightly contractionary. You can talk about how monetary policy is having less of an effect. And you can talk about the negatives of supply side policies in terms of the negatives that they can bring for structural unemployment. Thank you.